Why were the Greeks so influential? Why are so many names and ideas and words traced back to the Greek culture? In 1930, an author called Edith Hamilton wrote a book to try and explain why. I have felt while writing these new chapters a fresh realization of the refuge and strength the past can be to us in the troubled present. Let us keep our silent sanctuaries, Seneca wrote, for in them the eternal perspectives are preserved. Speaking about the age of the ancient world, the author writes, the Greeks have not the hallmarks that give title to a place there. The ancient world, so far as we can reconstruct it, bears everywhere the same stamp. In Egypt, in Crete, in Mesopotamia, wherever we can read bits of the story, we find the same conditions. A despot enthroned, whose whims and passions are the determining factor in the state. A wretched, subjugated populace. A great priestly organization to which is handed over the domain of the intellect. I never stopped to think about that fact before. In an age of kings and tyrants and emperors that lasted up to only a few centuries ago, and perhaps even still in some countries, the Greeks were alone in rejecting hereditary rule and trying to establish a democracy. They were the first Westerners. The spirit of the West, the modern spirit, is a Greek discovery, and the place of the Greeks is in the modern world. The Greeks were the first people in the world to play, and they played on a great scale. All over Greece there were games, all sorts of games, athletic contests of every description, races, horse, boat, foot, torch races, contests in music where one side outdid the other, in dancing, on greased skins, sometimes to display a nice skill of foot or balance of body. Games where men leapt in and out of flying chariots. Games so many one grows weary with a list of them. It goes without saying, so many competitions come down to us from the Greeks in the Olympic Games. Writing about the mind and the spirit of the Greek people, what was happiness for the Greeks? The exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. That's a very interesting way to sum up one of the main goals in life. The freedom to pursue excellence in a field of your own choosing. It took me many years to come to understand this point. I think we're all under a constant barrage of messages that we need to acquire X and Y and Z to be happy. The treadmill of consumerism never ends, and the satisfaction felt at each milestone is ephemeral or empty. When I compare this to my experience pursuing excellence in fields of my choosing, such as fatherhood or carpentry or jiu-jitsu, the milestones seem to have a much longer lasting effect and bring long-term contentment. Now I'd like to try and pursue excellence in reading and perhaps one day get close to intellectual excellence, although I fear I have a long way to go. The author quotes Aristotle as so characteristically Greek. Since reason is divine in comparison with man's whole nature, the life according to reason must be divine in comparison with usual human life. Nor ought we pay regard to those who exalt us, that as men we ought to think human things and keep our eyes upon mortality. Nay, as far may be, we should endeavour to rise to that which is immortal, and live in conformity with that which is best in us. Now, what is characteristic of any nature is that which is best for it and gives most joy. Such to a man is the life according to reason, since it is this that makes him man. Well, I can't argue with that. Imagine a world where clarity of thinking and reasoning was promoted instead of so much tribalism and hatred. The author then draws our attention to Greek art in comparison to the rest of the world. A famous Greek painter exhibited a picture of a boy holding a bunch of grapes, so lifelike the birds flew down to peck at them, and the people acclaimed him as the master artist. If I were, he answered, the boy would have kept the birds away. This little tale, with its delightful assumption of intelligent birds, is completely Greek in its fundamental assumption. Grapes were to be painted to look like grapes and boys to look like boys. And the reason was that nothing could be imagined so beautiful and so significant as the real. The Greek artist felt the world completely sufficient for the demands of the spirit. He had no wish to mark the images of his gods with strange, unearthly attributes to lift them away from earth. He had no wish to alter them at all from what he saw as most beautiful, the shapes of the human beings around him. We can see this very clearly when we compare statues of different parts of the world. Comparing the statues of Egypt, India, and the like, although equally beautiful and skillfully crafted, does not have the same realism we can see in the Greek statues of the same period. I imagine their focus on capturing the beauty of the natural world without embellishment added to the proliferation of great minds working to understand the natural world in math, science, and philosophy. Next, the author draws our attention to Athens. The Athenians are lovers of beauty without having lost the taste for simplicity, and lovers of wisdom without loss of manly vigor. I like that a lot. It took me a long time to begin to value wisdom. I focused most of my younger life on manly vigor, on sports, on fitness. Now I've come to understand that balance between the two is where real contentment lies. I believe that maintaining the balance between physical fitness, health, and mental stimulation are some of the foundations for a good life. Over the last few years, I can see that my favorite activities for a Sunday have changed a lot. Now I like nothing better than to wake up early, have a good workout, read some books, take a walk in the forest, and then go home for a nice home-cooked meal. As Pericles put it, Athenians love beauty with economy. Economy, the very opposite to the lavishness and exaggeration of the grandiose East. Well, that rings my bell. It reminds me of a quote from the first Dune book, when the author was describing a woman. Simple fitness of form without ornament. That always stuck in my mind. I've always struggled to accept the lavishness and the exuberance that you can see on display in places like the Vatican. It never seemed to sit well with me and the ideas promoted in the religion. So you could say I'm a lover of economy as well. Anyway, I digress. Chapter 8 talks about Herodotus, the first sightseer, the father of history. This section was one of my favorites. Learning about Herodotus was fascinating. I was very happy to learn his writings are part of the Harvard Classics series. He writes about his travels around the known world and the Persian Wars. As we can see, the known world was a lot smaller than our world. However, when I was reading through his histories, fascinating as they were, one question kept popping into my mind. What about the slaves? The author has spent 7 chapters singing the praises of the Greeks without one mention of them. But here Herodotus reports on several viewpoints. To Euripides, the glory belongs of being the first to condemn it. Slavery, he wrote, that thing of evil, by its nature evil, forcing submission from a man to what no man should yield to. Plato never spoke against slavery. In his old age, he actually advocated for it. Still, there are signs he was troubled by it. He says, a slave is an embarrassing possession. Aristotle wrote, a machine which breathes a piece of animated property. There are people, Aristotle writes, he does not include himself, who consider owning slaves as violating natural law, because the distinction between a slave and a free person is wholly conventional and has no place in nature, so that it rests on mere force and is devoid of justice. That is the point Greek thought had reached more than 2,400 years ago. Less than 100 years ago, America had to fight a great war before slavery was finally abolished. A few years after Aristotle, the Stoics denounced it as the most intolerable of all wrongs ever committed against man. So it took them a long time, but they got there a lot faster than the rest of the world. Herodotus writes, a tyrant disturbs ancient laws, violates women, kills man without trial. But a people ruling, first, the very name of it is so beautiful. And secondly, a people does none of these things. Rule by the people. What an interesting idea. Sprouting like a plant on a barren land. It's taken many centuries to come to fruition. We seem to be flooded with messages of our democratic values. But I don't see much ruling by the people. In fact, we seem to be ever more ruled by a silent minority. How many of us would really vote for so much war, or censorship, or surveillance? Next, the author takes a look at Thucydides. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge had little attraction for the Athenians. They were realists. Knowledge was to be desired because it had a value for living. It led men away from error to right action. He reasoned that since the nature of the human mind does not change any more than the nature of the human body, circumstances swayed by human nature are bound to repeat themselves. And in the same situation, men are bound to act in the same way unless it is shown to them that such a course in other days ended disastrously. Thucydides writes about war. It was something far beneath the surface, deep down in human nature, and the cause of all the wars ever fought. The motive power was greed. That strange passion for power and possession, which no power and no possession satisfy. Power, or its equivalent wealth, created the desire for more power, more wealth. The Athenians and the Spartans fought for one reason only, because they were powerful, and therefore were compelled to seek more power. We can see this again and again throughout history. Take, for example, the US after World War II, or after the fall of the USSR. After the Berlin Wall came down, the machine did not rest or retreat, only kept growing. There was talk of a peace dividend to be paid to citizens after all the savings from winding down the war machine. But a new enemy was quickly found to justify the ever-rising defense budgets. A historian who lived some 200 years after Thucydides, named Polybius, also a Greek, gave a condensed and concise summary of Thucydides' theory. Human history, he says, is a cycle which excess of power keeps revolving. Primitive despots start the wheel rolling. The more power they get, the more they want, and they go on abusing their authority until inevitably opposition is aroused, and a few men, strong enough, when they unite, seize the rules for themselves. These too can never be satisfied. They encroach upon the rights of others until they are opposed in their turn. The people are aroused against them, and democracy succeeds to oligarchy. But there again, the evil in all power is no less operative. It brings corruption and contempt for law until the state can no longer function and falls easily before a strong man who promises to restore order. The rule of the one, of the few, of the many, each is destroyed in turn because there is in them all an unvarying evil, a greed for power, and no moral quality is necessarily bound up with any of them. This next passage seems far too applicable to modern times when Thucydides is talking about Athens during the Peloponnesian War. She had reached a point where she did not care to use fine words about ugly facts, and the reason was that they had ceased to look ugly to her. Vices by then were esteemed as virtues. The very meaning of words changed. Deceit was praised as shrewdness, recklessness held to be courage, loyalty, moderation, generosity scorned as proofs of weakness. That goodwill, which is the chief element in a noble nature, was laughed out of court and vanished. Every man distrusted every other man. That was where the race for power brought the Athenians in the end. Where is the trust in our public officials in this modern age? How many behaviors do we see on a day-to-day basis that would have been outrageous only a few decades ago? The normalization of torture, of solitary confinement, of detention without trial, of mass surveillance, of drone strikes, decades-long occupations of foreign lands, all spring to mind. Moving on, there's a quote from Xenophon, which really jumped out to me. He who conquers by force may fancy that he can continue to do so, but the only conquest that lasts is when men willingly submit to those who are better than themselves. The only way really to conquer a country is through generosity. Well, the modern world certainly hasn't caught up with Xenophon. Just look at the 20 years in Afghanistan. What was achieved? What happened when the Allied forces pulled out? Next, the author takes a look at Greek tragedies, comedies, and drama. Gillius wrote, He saw the inexorable working out of the curse. He knew that the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. The truth to reconcile these truths he found in the experience of men, which the men of his generation must have realized far beyond others, that pain and error have their purpose and their use. They are steps on the ladder of knowledge. God, whose law it is that he who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our own despite, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. Isn't that a tragic truth? As we go through life, we collect difficult memories, traumas. Everyone has to suffer. And some of the most lasting lessons are the ones that hurt most at the time. Sophocles wrote, "For never all days free from pain are given to mortals by the son of Cronos, but joy and grief, the wheels of time, roll around to all, even as circling pathways of the stars. Nothing abides for men, not bright bespangled night, not doom, not death. Wealth comes and goes, and grief and gladness." We collect grief and gladness as we journey through this world, with experience arriving just after we need it. The author spends some time talking about the religion of the Greeks. She makes it clear that the Greeks had a lot of freedom to criticize religion and priests. They obviously had a lot of religious freedom and freedom of speech. In Greece, there was no dominant church or creed. There was a dominating idea, which everyone would want to pursue if he caught sight of it. Different men saw it differently. It was one thing to the artist, another to the warrior. Excellence is the nearest equivalent we have to the word they commonly use for it. But it meant more than that. It was the utmost perfection possible, the very best and highest a man could attain to, which, when perceived, always has a compelling authority. A man must strive to attain it. Hesiod wrote something similar. "Before the gates of excellence, the high guards have placed sweat. Long is the road thereto, and steep and rough at first. But when the height is won, there is ease, though grievously hard in the winning." Well, never has a quote more aptly applied to jiu-jitsu. So they didn't take their religion too seriously, but what did they believe about an afterlife? The author draws our attention to passages from several prominent Greeks talking about their experiences with the Eleusinian mysteries. This was a secret society that met once a year to practice a ritual we know very little about, but nonetheless is very interesting to hear. Cicero, clearly an initiate, says, "Nothing is higher than these mysteries. They have not only shown us how to live joyfully, but they have taught us how to die with a better hope. All we are sure of is that they awakened a deep sense of reverence in all, that they offered purification from sin, and that they promised immortality." Plutarch writes, when consoling a friend on the loss of a child, "When a man dies, he is like those who are initiated into the mysteries. A whole life is a journey by tortuous ways without outlet. At the moment of quitting, it comes terrors, shuddering fear, amazement, then a light that moves to meet you, pure meadows that receive you, songs and dances and holy apparitions." This reminds me of a book called The Immortality Key, which I've been meaning to read for a long time. The author argues that these mysteries and many others in ancient religions have their roots in psychedelic experiences. With my personal experience with psychedelics, I could see how a yearly dose would help society in a number of ways, and perhaps that's why the ancient Greeks produced so many great thinkers and artists. I certainly feel like a philosopher after a nice relaxing day peering through the doors of perception. In the final two chapters, the author focuses on the differences between the Greek culture and our modern day culture. We are interested in people's special characteristics, the things in this or that person which are different from the general. Greeks, on the contrary, thought that what was important in man were precisely the qualities that he shared with all mankind. We don't see enough of that talk in the modern day. The intense individualization has molded our spirit, and it has brought us problems new in the history of mankind. Together with trouble of mind and bitter disagreement, where once there was ease and unanimity, it is not men's greed, nor their ambition, nor yet their machines. It is not even the removal of the ancient landmarks that is filling our present world with turmoil and dissension, but our new vision of the individual's claim against the majority's claim. The Greeks saw what is permanently important in a man and unites him to the rest. If we can follow that method, and through our own intense realization of ourselves, reach a unity with all men, seeing as deeply as the great tragic poets of old saw, that what is of any importance in us is what we share with all, then there will be a great new distribution in the scales, and the balance held so evenly in those great days of Greece may be ours as well. This reminds me a lot of JFK's famous peace speech. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Well, this was a great book. I really enjoyed it. The video turned out a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, so I apologize if I bored any of you. I've read quite a lot about Greek mythology, but not too much about the literature, so this book was really eye-opening. Let me know what you thought about the ideas brought up in this book, and any ideas for the next books in the comments below. With that, goodbye, my friends. May your days be long and full of the pursuit of excellence.